More than half of the top 500 companies in the United States now see artificial intelligence as posing potential risk. That's a five-fold increase in just 2 years, according to a new survey. And some believe the technology could become a threat to their businesses. So what's driving these fears? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Artificial intelligence was once the stuff of science fiction, but now it's part of life. Lots of us might not know it, but AI is found in activities including healthcare, mobile phones, manufacturing, transport, road vehicles and entertainment, to name only a few areas. At home, you might find it in a washing machine or cooking appliances. Seen as a revolution by some that could change our lives, the fanfare of enthusiasm for artificial intelligence just a couple of years ago is, however, giving way to rising concerns among businesses over the risks it poses. The findings come from a study by Arise AI using the annual reports of the 500 of the largest companies in the US, many of which operate around the world.
In 2022, 9% of the biggest US companies cited artificial intelligence as a concern, but now more than half are wary of AI and see it as a potential risk. Some industries are more worried than others. More than 90% of US media and entertainment companies view it as a threat. Software and technology, telecommunications, healthcare and financial services also show higher levels of concern than other sectors. Companies' concerns are wide-ranging. Some are concerned about confidential information that could be accessed and leaked by employees. Others fear new levels of government regulation to cope with a rapidly evolving technology. And others fear losing out to competitors with better technology. 2/3 of firms surveyed see generative AI, the technology that can produce text, images, audio and videos, as a risk. That follows a boom in predictive machine learning technology during the past 2 years after the launch of ChatGPT. But some sectors are keen on adopting AI and see it as a benefit. They include the automotive, energy and manufacturing industries.
Well, let's discuss all of this now with our guests. In Geneva, we have Adrian Monck, Senior Advisor on AI and Technology and the long-time Managing Director of the World Economic Forum. In Dublin, Elaine Burke is a science and technology journalist who hosts the podcast For Tech's Sake. And in Manchester, Cary is a Professor of Organisational Psychology and Health at the University of Manchester and President of CIPD, the UK's professional body for human resources and people development. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. I want to talk about what these big firms think of AI in a moment, but let's just talk about AI in general and how much of a revolution it is. Adrian, put this into some historical context. Compare this, for example, with the birth of the internet, or going back even further, the Industrial Revolution. How big a deal is AI?
I think AI is going to be a very big deal, but, there are a lot of cynics out there. If you look at Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, he said the impact of the internet was going to be less than that of a fax machine. So there's a lot of people out there who are actually very cynical about these kind of technology developments. But I think AI is going to be an enormous boon and an incredible leapfrog technology for folks who haven't been in the technology game, who can come in and bring great new stuff to it. And if you look at regions that are really well set for that, regions with big energy capabilities like the Middle East, and they're in great shape for benefiting from a technology like artificial intelligence, which needs a lot of energy.
So, Elaine, same question to you. Compare it with sort of 3 decades ago and the birth of the internet. Is AI as big a deal?
It definitely feels that way in the current context, and it's hard to think what we'll think in retrospect. But I do think we probably will quite soon get to a phase where it's ordinary to be using a tool like this, and it's actually kind of boring and maybe even a bit tedious. The way things that would have seemed remarkable at their time, like email, have become today. And I think that will be the real sign of its endurance as a general purpose technology, is when it becomes everyday and actually less exciting.
Cary Cooper, can you tell us your take on this? Do you think the public have got their heads around what AI could do yet?
No, I don't think the public have it at all. I think it is a big deal. But guess what? I mean, AI has been going on for a long time. Law firms use it to read contracts. It's everywhere. So it's been around for the last 5 years in any case. I think the general public and businesses even themselves don't have this view that it's going to be some transformative thing. So transformative. I think Adrian illustrated that by saying, I mean, probably they think it's like the introduction of the computer, that fundamental. But actually, AI is already being used. Funny enough, I think we're fantasizing, all of us, about its potential negatives rather than concentrating on the potential positives and how we're going to manage the process.
Adrian, I'm talking about this report from this group Arise, but I've also been looking at some other recent research by the management consultants McKinsey, saying that AI could add to the global economy between $2.6 trillion and $4.4 trillion annually. And the report goes on to say this: it seems possible that within the next 3 years, that's a pretty short timeline, anything not connected to AI will be considered obsolete or ineffective. I mean, that sounds like hype.
I think when you look at any professional services report, you're going to see a lot more hype because these are marketing documents, marketing the wares of professional services folks who want to come in and help companies with those transitions they're talking about. But there is an incredible opportunity here for artificial intelligence technology, natural language processing, machine learning, all of these things to come in and transform processes. And some of the people I'm talking to are very, very straightforward manufacturing businesses, which used to have to do things like check what their products were coming off the line. They've installed artificial intelligence technology, and that can do what used to take them hours and days in microseconds. So potentially what McKinsey's talking about are very real gains for very ordinary businesses that can really make a huge difference to their processes.
Elaine, we were talking and comparing this to the birth of the internet. Remember, back then there was the dot-com bubble, and then there was a crash. Do you have any worries?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern at the moment that this is a bit of a bubble. And even those projections that you mentioned, they may be borne out simply because there's a lot of vested interests that need to see AI succeed because so much has been pumped into it. And even what it's being tipped to service people for in the media most of the time aren't perhaps the things that will be most effective. Like Adrian mentioned, how it can be useful in manufacturing. That's not really getting the most media coverage. They're mostly talking about content creation, things like customer service and marketing. And I do find that you may also see a pivot when it becomes an actual business differentiator, that you have a human touch, that you don't rely on these systems, that you pride yourself on having actual people that your clients and customers can interact with to solve their problems. That could actually end up becoming a business gain, because sometimes you switch to these systems too fervently and they aren't as successful as what you would have gotten maybe if they were assisting your human workers, or if you had human workers involved from the start.
Well, all of you, Adrian, seem to think that AI is a very, very big deal. Explain to me then what you make of this survey, the Arise survey we're talking about today, which is the Fortune 500 companies. They seem to be, some of them, a bit freaked out about the prospects. Why?
I think when you look at this report, and by the way, it's probably generated by AI technology itself, looking through all of these different reports. But when you look at the kind of concerns companies have, initially with any technology, there's a great excitement. There's a great sense that this is going to transform our business. We can make something of it. And then companies start to look at the costs of implementation. They look at cybersecurity issues. They have technology teams who tell them that this is not something that can be seamlessly integrated with their existing technology stacks. So all of the kind of concerns that have been bubbled up behind the enthusiasm come to the fore. And I think with AI, we're at that phase of the kind of curve of adoption where people are starting to know that they've got to get to grips with it, but they don't really know what exactly they've got to do to put it in place. And remember, going back to the dot-com boom, when I was a young MBA student at London Business School, we were told that there'd be no more car showrooms, no more bookshops. It wasn't the book dealers who innovated, it was Jeff Bezos. There's a lot of outside companies right now who are going to come into the space occupied by the people that Arise have been looking at. And those are going to be the companies, I think, that we're going to see taking on AI and bringing it to the next level.
Cary, though, when normally there is new technology, new innovations which can cut jobs and increase profits, corporations normally embrace it. What do you think about their caution at this moment?
I'm quite interested in this report because normally it's the employees who are very worried about it. And yet some surveys are showing the employees are concerned about it, but they also think that it has potential for them because it could make the dull parts of their job, eliminate the dull parts of the job and provide an added value. So I'm quite surprised that companies are all worried about it. Normally it's companies saying, come on, let's do this, let's go. And they're worried about how the employees are going to adapt to it. I think the opposite is happening now because I think employees want more. Look at, a lot of people are always fearful of change. Technology, people are always think they're going to lose their jobs. Every technological innovation has a transition point where people actually, the job changes, but actually what ends up happening is they do different things and usually more added value things that are more exciting, more interesting, and less dull. So employees, funny enough, from my experience in the UK, is employees have embraced this a bit, but they're still unsure because they're not quite sure what this damn thing is. What is AI? I don't know. What potentially can it do for me? But they're seeing some benefits of it already, actually. But a lot of this, in my view, has to do with how this AI is managed in the organization. And if it's not managed properly, then you're going to have problems.
Elaine, this report is about the Fortune 500 companies, so the biggest companies in the United States. Could it be that these are the biggest companies in the world and they have the most to lose potentially, whereas smaller, leaner companies maybe don't have the same worries?
Well, the bigger companies can probably ride the wave more successfully. We've even seen the missteps of some of the leaders in this space, and they have survived them. The reason why we no longer talk about Google Bard is because it had to be rebranded as Gemini, because Google made so many mistakes in the launch of that were quite embarrassing for the company, but it has ridden that out. And I do think Cary makes a good point about what are we talking about when we talk about AI. This report is compared to a 2022 report where there was only 9% concern raised amongst these companies when it came to AI. And that precedes the release of the generative AI systems that we're now familiar with and that are now getting a lot of coverage. So it seems to be that generative AI as a form of AI in particular, not necessarily automation, not even necessarily things like computer vision, which would be very useful in the manufacturing space that Adrian mentioned. It's the generative AI that seems to cause a lot of concern. And there are a lot of question marks and unknowns about generative AI and the risks that it brings to a business, even on what it's been trained on, whether that's going to be decided as being a breach of copyright, a breach of intellectual property of the content that's involved in those models. And then it's also who owns the models, because what's emerging now is that we have some key players that have some quite powerful large language models that are then being used by other companies. Some startups have built entire businesses on someone else's model. And if that access changes for some reason, or if even the price of that access changes, that could destroy a small company that's just starting to play around in this space. And what we're seeing come up is the idea of large language models as a service, the way we've seen software as a service become as a popular business sector as well.
Adrian, let's have a little bit of context and history from you. I mean, when there is disruption in business, the biggest companies don't always stay the biggest companies. A notable example, personal computing revolution in the 1980s. The biggest name in computers then was IBM. Are we in one of those moments where the big companies, not all of them, are going to stay the big companies?
I think we are potentially at one of those moments. I think what's interesting is nobody knows where those kind of things are going to come from. If you go back to the dawn of search, for example, there was Northern Lights, Alta Vista, probably half a dozen other things, Yahoo, etc., which were all going to be conquering search technology. And then suddenly out of nowhere, out of Stanford comes Google, a couple of guys, and they transform an entire industry, in fact, create one with Eric Schmidt. Now, that is where we potentially are right now with AI technology, but we haven't gotten that outline yet of where that innovation is going to come from. But the potential is definitely there. And the two things that technology needs, it needs the chips and it needs the energy. And if you can put those two things together in a meaningful, cost-effective way, then potentially you can come in and start to really, really make a difference. What's different from back in the early 2000s boom is those chips are now regulated, access to them is highly regulated, and also energy. Energy is not something that you can just turn on and turn off. It's something that is a huge global resource that basically requires incredible infrastructure and incredible resource richness to provide. And if you've got those kind of things, and for example, the Middle East has them absolutely, then you're potentially in a good position to disrupt and really make a difference in this space. And you can see players like Abu Dhabi, like Dubai, like Saudi Arabia coming in and really investing here. And they potentially have an opportunity to make a real difference in this space.
Let's look in this report at some of the specific things that companies say they're worried about in AI. Cary, Motorola, the telecom firm, says AI may not always operate as intended and data sets may be insufficient or contain illegal, biased, harmful or offensive information. AI does currently, as it operates, makes mistakes. I think they call them hallucinations.
I like that. As a psychologist, I certainly like that. Sure, all technologies have downsides to them. I think there's a lot of fear around. There's always been about the fear, whether it's, no matter what it's been, it's fear about the internet, the intrusiveness, the privacy issues on the internet. This has always happened. For me, it's all about how do we embrace it? How do we get our people together? How do we openly discuss it with our employees and think of the benefits that we can achieve? And I think that's an issue I'm more worried about as an organizational psychologist. How do we create the right kind of culture to work with our employees to think of its benefits and potentially the risks? There will be risks with all technology, and we have to look at those risks and see how we can circumvent them and how we can actually do things again. Listen, this is not going to go away. And the future is going to be with AI. And incidentally, where did it start? If you look at ChatGPT, that wasn't started with organizations. That started with individuals. They embraced it. That's probably why they're less negative about it than the employer seems to be. But the employer will benefit from this if they set up a good psychological contract with their employees and figure a way through what would be the benefits in what kind of AI and what would potentially be the risks and how do we minimize those risks? Not a problem. This is our future, man. We can't ignore it, and we can't say, well, we can't do it for those reasons, but let's mitigate the risks.
Elaine, something else from the report. Disney, the big entertainment company, warns that rules governing new technology developments remain unsettled. I mean, we don't have rules, we don't have regulation yet, and this is moving so fast, and yet if you were going to have some sort of international agreement, the wheels of international diplomacy move so slowly. There's a big problem here, isn't there?
Yeah, no, we're moving faster here in the EU in that this month, the AI Act officially starts a ticking clock essentially until August next year when they expect a certain level of compliance with that act. So what happens there remains to be seen, but it is, taking place. There is regulation in place for these systems and for general purpose AI. But I do think a company like Disney will have huge concerns about those issues I raised around intellectual property, especially considering over the past weekend, the Grok AI model was used to produce images of Mickey Mouse doing things that Disney would never like to see Mickey Mouse associated with. And that's something that a litigious company like Disney, I'm sure, will have great issues with. And it shows when these systems are built without those guardrails in place that, other systems don't allow you to make images like that, but this one did. It shows that is possible quite simply, depending on who is developing the model and what it's allowed to do. But I do think in that context, people are fearful of this, not because of the natural inclination to fearing change, which I don't disagree with, that is a true thing. But also we're dealing with a much more tech savvy populace at this stage as well than we were dealing with the advent of things like computing and the early days of the internet. And there are people entering the workforce today who've never known a world without the internet. They're a lot more clued in about this stuff. I think they're a lot more savvy, and I think they're more cautious because of the things that have gone before. We have seen now what's happening with the problems and lack of regulation when it comes to social media. what has transpired there, because an industry was allowed to grow at a great rate without anyone coming in and putting reins on it, putting safeguards in place. So I think people are cautious about AI taking that same route into becoming so embedded in our lives before we've really stopped and thought about at what cost. And as well as things like the disinformation and misinformation problems that stem from generative AI, there are those energy costs that were raised by Adrian as well. So do we want systems that are costing the earth just so people can make funny images of Mickey Mouse? Or do we want them to be doing productive things in terms of healthcare, energy management, and things like that? And that's another thing that people are more concerned with now. They are more climate conscious and they are more conscious consumers generally.
So, Adrian, if we do want something that is productive and beneficial for humanity, how do you regulate AI and how do you get this done quickly, given that this is moving so fast and AI, quite literally as we speak, is still being constantly invented?
Yeah, I mean, if AI innovation moves at the speed of lawyers, then we're in for a very slow journey of innovation. I think the reality is that there's been a lot of lessons from the way technology's rolled out, and governments are more interested in things like agile regulation, which is something that the World Economic Forum has a lot of experience with. But the idea that you regulate alongside the companies producing, that you get them involved in the discussions early, and that you actually have a dialogue with them and the relevant bodies, because the old days of having a kind of, geo-fenced national only regulatory system are well gone. The airline industry doesn't roll like that. A lot of other industries can't operate in that kind of framework, and AI is no different. So I think we need a very different paradigm for looking at AI regulation, but there are examples we can draw on. And I think, with where the industry is right now, probably the players exist and the interests exist for those conversations to start. And governments like the Korean government, you've seen the Saudi Arabian government convening people, you've also seen the British government and the French government. I think those kind of governments getting behind some idea of what the next phase of AI regulation looks like is going to be very helpful.
Cary, we've been talking, you mentioned workers earlier on, we've been talking mainly about companies in this. What about individual workers? How worried should they be? And how worried should trade unions, for example, be about people losing their jobs, people being mass unemployment in some sectors?
Yeah, they are worried. I mean, the unions are worried. I think the individuals are potentially less worried, strangely enough, in this technology. Listen, there'll be some who will be very worried, will it replace my job? But the history shows that all these technologies actually, in the end, create jobs. There is a transition period. Absolutely, for sure, where jobs change and aspects of your job disappear and AI will take them over, but it will enable you to do other things. And I think the trade unions will be very worried about this, about major job loss. Hey, we've heard this all along when computers first came. Oh my God, everybody's going to lose their job. I remember, I'm that old. I remember when Harold Wilson, when I first came to the UK, he had the great heat of technology speech in 1964. We said, but the technology is going to take our lives over. By the year 2000, we're going to be working 15-hour weeks. We won't need people because technology will take over. That hasn't happened. We're actually working longer hours than we did in 1964. So I think the evidence is jobs will change. Yes, people won't lose their jobs, but if they embrace it and if management is clever enough to engage people, develop a good psychological contract, work with their people to enable them to do better and do different kind of work, there won't be a problem. Trade unions will certainly react to this and are already concerned about it. But, this is what change produces.
Elaine, then, there'll be people watching this who are a little worried. Who should be worried about losing their jobs? Which sectors do you think?
Well, I do think a good example of the kind of collective actions role in this was the writer's strike out of the States, which they did negotiate a contract about the use of AI being something that would empower them as opposed to disempower them. And I think that was a really good example to follow. But there's kind of, whatever report you look at, there seems to be no limit to the job risks that exist inherently in AI, because it seems to be such a flexible technology that can do bits and pieces of a lot of things that a lot of us would do in our day-to-day lives, unless you're someone who specifically works with things hands-on, that you're like a tradesperson working with things like plumbing and construction and that kind of thing. desk workers are probably at the highest risk here, depending on the various things that they do in their day-to-day jobs. And we are seeing layoffs. I mean, last year was a significant year for layoffs, and it's down about 40% this year, but there's still been over 130,000 job layoffs this year so far. So it's still going to be probably the second highest year for layoffs. And what is happening that's quite interesting is there seems to be an interim job loss period, that it's not necessarily that you're losing your job to an AI that's replacing or supplanting you, but actually you're losing your job to increased investment in AI, because this is a great expense for these businesses and they need to have data centers to run these things. They need to put all of the investment into the energy to run the data, and all of this costs money, and they're taking a risk that they are going to lose their human capital and invest it into those other capital projects instead.
So, Adrian, with this upheaval and change, and some people maybe having to change jobs, is this a potential headache for governments around the world as well?
We have never been good at helping people transition from industry to industry. If you look at the UK, for example, when it shut down the mining industry, it basically pushed people into disability and sickness benefit. If you look at other kind of big transitions historically in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people were left behind. And we've seen in places like Detroit and in industrial wastelands in heavy industry centers across the advanced economies that we really haven't got a very good system in place for shifting people from good jobs in industries that are being hit by new technology. So governments have really, really got to think hard about how they manage this transition, because people don't want to leave behind good jobs for starting right at the bottom of the tree in terms of their next career. So how can we help people reskill and shift across at levels of pay and seniority that actually help them feel valued and not feel like this technology is coming in, destroying their lives, wreaking havoc with their opportunities?
Elaine, there seems to be one problem, which is probably good for the people involved, but there seems to be a shortage of AI experts. Companies are struggling to find people who have the right expertise, and they all want to work on building new models rather than working for accountants or banks.
Yeah, and they really are getting scooped up. If you look at the percentages of the PhD candidates in AI being scooped up by the big tech companies alone, I think it's something like 3/4 of them have ended up in roles in those kind of companies, as opposed to even staying on in academia and building maybe tools and services that could be put to public use when it comes to AI and the benefits we can glean from it. So there's a lot of concern there. And even in terms of AI research, it's becoming increasingly dominated by research that's coming directly from a company and obviously in line with their agenda, or in some way an academic industry collaboration where both parties are involved in the research. There's less percentage of the research coming purely from academia, which is also a cause for concern here, because you don't want the science behind this and the messaging to be completely co-opted by commercial interests.
OK, thank you very much to all three of our guests today, Adrian Monck, Elaine Burke and Cary Cooper. A fascinating discussion. If you came to the show late, you can find it again on our website, aljazeera.com. What should we discuss next time on the programme? We want to hear from you. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or message or tag us on X, where we're at AJ Inside Story. From all the team here in Doha, stay safe. I'm James Bays, and I'll see you back here very soon. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.